And there she is. Thank you, Alex. Hey, Will, how's it going? Good seeing you.
Hello, good to see you.
We'll get started here in just another couple of minutes. We'll start on time. Hi, Jenny. Good seeing you.
Hello.
Sorry,
Hey, everybody.
following my usual, hey, Tom. Following my usual, if I see someone on camera, I say hello, but not saying hello to every single person. So I follow that trap sometimes. We'll get started in just another moment. See our other task force members joining. Hello, fellow task force members, and also our guests and the public. Hi, Sean. Good seeing you. All right, Alex, if you are a task force member, I would ask you to turn your cameras on at this time. Thank you so much. Hi, Kristen. Good seeing you. If everyone else can as well. Dave, thank you. That would be terrific. And then Alex, you can let me know when we, hello, Dan. You can let me know when we have a quorum and then we can get kicked off here.
Looks like we have 9 of 15 currently.
Okay, let's give it one more moment to just let people chime in. I think we're missing at least one if out of office replies are any indication. I think we'll miss Athena.
Athena's on vacation and Rep Evans will be at another board, but his staff is here to fill him in.
Okay.
I don't want that view.
And if you're not a member of the task force, if you can turn your camera off, that would be great. And we will, as well as mute yourself. That's fantastic. And we'll give it one more moment and then we'll get kicked off. All right. Well, welcome all. Thank you for joining our 5th Truth in Labeling Task Force meeting. We're grateful for everyone's attendance, and I want to kick off by thanking my fellow task force members. There's been a lot of information and files shared with folks over the last several weeks, recordings, and I know I've heard from a number of you. I know that there's been homework to be done, and it's been done, and we're grateful for that hard work that you've done. Also want to share again our thanks to DEQ for the incredible support and leadership that they've shown, in particular Alex Bertolucci, who's on the call. Alex, thank you so much. These meetings would not happen without your assistance, and we're grateful for it. And also thanks to my co-chair, Dr. Brandon. Thank you so much for all your hard work as well. We wanted to get kicked off. So our agenda today for today's meeting is after this welcome and our announcements, we're going to have a discussion of accessibility, that we got a straw poll, that we got some information from everybody what accessibility means to them. We are then going to have a Q&A, a live Q&A with the speakers who were on the recordings that we shared out with the task force members. The task force meeting 4.5, as we were colloquially calling it, to be able to gather more information from experts. They are on the line now, and we'll be able to ask them at 2. We may start a little early depending on how long the accessibility conversation goes. And then we're going to get into our discussion of our proposals, the 2.0 proposals. And so that is the adjusted proposals that we discussed at the last meeting. And we did some straw polls voting on those proposals. And then we also did a straw poll on an additional full proposal from the AURA members who are task force members. And if we, as we get into that, if we need to take more straw polls through roll call, we definitely suggest that task force members call for those roll calls so we can dig in. And then we're going to have our public input and then our next steps and homework. So real quick at the top, as we are welcoming everyone, the public input is up to 5 people at 2 minutes each. So if you do wish to speak as a member of the public, or you have a question, please put your name in the chat to Alex, and Alex will put you in line to be able to provide comment. And I'll remind a couple more times to make sure that we're able to capture that public input, but please do. And before we move on to the next conversation, I see that Task Force member Kristen Mitchell is raising her hands. Yes, Kristen, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. It's nice to see everyone. I just have a couple point of order pieces that I wanted to raise in the beginning piece. If we could do that now, I think it'll be helpful in the process. So, back to the conversation about transparency and public process and how important that is to all of us, including the people that are taking the time to listen in on this conversation. I know we're moving fast. I know we have a deadline. I just want to reiterate my request that if there's information that comes in, it's provided out to the task force members as quickly as possible. I think raw data is better than somehow compiled data or information. I think it's better to see what people's opinions are directly versus having that material somehow massaged into proposals like it was for the April 4th meeting. So I just want to toss that out there as my first point. Next, I'd just like to say I took the time to watch the conversations on the RIC code, as well as the innovative labeling, the smart labeling pieces, which I thought were both really great. I just would like to say, would have been nice, if possible, to have invited the entire task force to participate in those discussions. I would not suggest that that means you would have delayed the times and tried to find a time that works for everybody on their complicated schedules. I get that, but just the opportunity to hear it live. I appreciate the fact that they're going to be here today to ask some questions, but I think there's just a difference in being able to participate in a discussion when it happens versus, try and focus the time to pay attention to it when you're doing other things on a list. So just going forward, if we have more optional meetings, I think just an easy invitation to the group to participate if they can would be helpful. And finally, the last piece is on voting and the suggestion that if we want to vote on a particular element, that a task force member should seek a roll call vote. I would just toss it out there that every vote should be a roll call vote, and not anybody should have the requirement or responsibility to ask for that every time. If we were in the room together versus the Zoom room that we're in right now, that's exactly how it would happen. And I think it would just be easier on all of us if we know going forward, we're just going to do roll call votes every time there's a conversation. So I toss that out there. And if that needs to be a roll call vote as a motion, then we could start with that if you wish. Thanks.
Sure, Kristen. I thank you for that feedback. Your feedback, which is reiterated from the last meeting, is well noted, and we appreciate that feedback. Again, any of the inconveniences that you've highlighted have all been done for the interest of expediency because of the incredible time pressure that we have. And we've really tried to be as open as you've requested at every single turn that you have made a request. We have responded to those requests, and we will continue to do so. We have tried to design this for ease of compliance of all task force members, as we're all very, very busy people, and to be able to have the most robust conversation as we possibly can. And we hope that we are able to achieve the high standards that you've set. So thank you for the feedback, Kristen, and we will definitely dig in.
Just to confirm then, will we be doing a roll call vote on everything, or is someone going to have to recall to say it? Can we just agree now that we're going to move forward with roll call voting? I'm comfortable with doing a simple vote, but I would look to my co-chair and other task force members to see if there's any opposition to that.
I see Alex just came onto video, and I was wondering if you would like to speak to that based on our rules, Alex.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Vice Chair Anya. The rules of the task force do say a task force member may vote by telephone or digitally. If a task force member requests voting may be by roll call. So I would say that we either need to update the rules with a vote or continue to just have folks request the roll call vote when they move forward.
So roll call vote to you means you're going to call everybody's name and they have to do an oral aye or nay, versus roll call vote means you ask everybody and they can give you a thumbs up, thumbs down by person, and you note that as well, just to confirm what you mean by roll call. So we're talking about the same language.
It's not defined in the rules.
Right.
However, I would say that individual public voting instead of via the chat. So however that is done, a thumbs up, thumbs down,
Right,
a voice
right.
vote, something like that.
So for example, I'm sitting here right now and I can do this and gives you a thumbs up and I say that's a yes vote. And if I had a no vote, I don't really have a thumbs down version of that, I don't think, but just something that makes it quick. I'm not trying to make it onerous, and I know that you need to track that, Alex, for purposes of making sure we've voted, but I do think we're kind of getting down to the wire on some of these conversations, and it would probably be better to have the information out there, because the way the process is set under the statutory version, it's a majority of the voting members that make decisions. So we're going to need to know who they are and what those votes are.
Yeah, I would recommend making that saying that we can change the rules based on a majority of the votes. So if you'd like to do that.
Yeah, and I will say that I'm calling for a change to those voting rules per task force member Kristen Mitchell, and to see if we'll take a quick vote. So do I say all in favor, say aye? I'm not exactly sure how to do this. All in favor, give the thumbs up if you know how to do the thumbs up. And I will say that I thought I did, but I don't see if I do now. So
it's under reactions, Dylan. If you look under reactions, you get your choices where it's raise hand or thumbs up.
The problem is I'm sharing my screen. So
yeah, more complicated.
You can give me a physical thumbs up as well if that's
physical
easier
thumbs
for
up.
folks. Excellent. And then is anyone opposed to this? Tom, I'm assuming that. Thank you. Okay, seeing none, looks like it passes unanimously.
Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you again for your robust suggestions and feedback, Kristen, and hopefully we're heading in the right direction and hitting the measure of transparency that is appropriate for this meeting. And so with that, I would love to, unless there are any other oppositions, I'm with
just a quick technical note.
Oh, yes.
Dylan.
Sorry. Go ahead, Tom. I didn't know you were raising your hand. I thought it was the
it's all
voting.
good.
So
go ahead. Good. I just from experience doing this exact thing, the recording does not record the emotions and the reactions. So the only way to capture a vote in recording via hands or thumbs is to physically raise your hand or give a thumbs up. So I would suggest the committee does that so staff can review the recordings to confirm the votes.
Thank you, Tom. Well put. So for all task force members, let's do a physical thumbs up that we have it, that is visible. And Alex, if you wouldn't mind, if somebody does not vote or you're not able to capture the vote, just call that out so we can make sure we get that. Do you have your hand raised as well, Will? And you're on mute.
Thank you. Thought I clicked it, wasn't clicking hard enough. I was going to say that I echo what Kristen says about the recorded meetings. I really liked them. I thought there was a ton of information in there. And again, you not necessarily trying to find the time, make the time, and then just let us know when it is, and then we can observe or ask. I just think that would be great because I really like that information. Also, I was going to say that there is a thumbs down button, but if it's not being recorded, it doesn't matter. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Well put. In the future, if we have an in-between meeting that has further interviews, which we do not currently have plans to do so, we'll make sure that everyone is invited to it. And again, hope that the recordings were valuable, and we will, at the top of the hour, get into our the asking them directly, because all of them are on all of them will be on the line at 2. So with that, is there anything else before I move on to our discussion of accessibility? Okay, terrific. So we did a bit of a word cloud here. Thank you again to Alex and DEQ staff for putting this together. This is capturing what we think of when we think about accessibility. Most folks were on the same page where you talked about size of symbols and text, colors that folks can understand, understandable language, symbols, acronyms, and if using smart labels, access to technology, which came up, of course, during the recorded smart label interview with Kim Holmes, and then standard placement. And really wanted to just see if there's any further considerations about this. My suggestion leading on the discussion of accessibility is that we have this conversation and we keep this in mind as we move forward when we're looking at each of the individual proposals, and that we pause before voting on those individual proposals or components to ask whether or not there are questions about accessibility that we can answer or potentially even adjust, as all of this is meant to be an iterative process, and we'll be developing that. So with that, Anya, would you like to maybe drive us through a bit of a conversation on this piece and let other people speak?
Absolutely. And first, I'll just echo Dylan's thanks for everyone filling this out in advance. It's really helpful just to get us, kind of a quick pulse check of where we all are as a task force in terms of how we're thinking about this, and would welcome anyone's thoughts on, why these issues came up, examples you've seen, and then really thinking about how do we go about operationalizing these pieces into our proposals. How do we apply an equity and accessibility screen into our recommendations? So we'll turn it over to my fellow task force members if anyone wants to take a stab at that discussion.
Any thoughts from fellow task force members? Everybody responded, so would love to hear any reflections that you had. Oh, go ahead, Dave.
I was just wondering if someone with a better memory than I can help in the smart label presentation that was given. There was some reference made to a study of smartphone use that was used sort of as, I guess, proof to say, look, enough people have smartphones that we shouldn't it shouldn't be something we worry about. I may not have that right, but if someone, Dylan or Anya, if you could expand upon that, that might help us here.
Absolutely. And there were links to the studies that are in the presentation that Kim gave that I shared out earlier today with all the task force members, and will also be posted later on today on the Truth in Labeling Task Force website. Yes, so there were two pieces of research. One was research that was done as I believe by CBA that said that they found that the threshold was high enough for it to be accessible to enough Americans for the smart labeling the smart labeling mandate for GMO labeling, for nutritional labeling that was on pack for food packaging. The other research was by Pew Research, and it was research from last year that the Recycling Partnership shared that found that 85% of Americans have access or own a smartphone. Sorry, not access, they own a smartphone. And so really that felt like obviously a vast majority of the populace having a smartphone felt that it met that level of accessibility. And Alex has shown the Pew Research link that has a compilation of that research.
Mr. Chair, just not to be sarcastic here, but how many of those 85% know how to use their smartphones?
So thank you, Mr. Task Force Member Kramer. I don't know the answer to that question. You certainly can read the research there. There is I would suggest at least anecdotal evidence shows that more and more people are learning how to use smartphones, in particular QR codes, as we have been trained over the course of the pandemic when we go to restaurants to take a little picture of that QR code that seems to be on many restaurant tables. But that said, perhaps further research is necessary there. We did not talk about I did not dig into the training available in addition to that that level of smartphone ownership.
You also,
So all due respect to that, I want to say that we've got urban and rural divide here. So not all of us had access to those QR code menus,
Sure.
and so I think that's one of the biggest pieces that we're confronted with 582 is how do we get the recyclables from Eastern Oregon to markets, and so that's kind of where we're headed with all of this. But I think that deserves at least some thoughts. Thank you.
I fully agree. Any other thoughts or considerations that we feel? Go ahead, Will.
I'm a big proponent of the size factor. I mean, it seems like when you're looking at labels on a container, it seems like the smallest possible readable font is used and the smallest possible little chasing arrows. For my eyes that are going slowly, like most of ours probably, I was looking at the recycling on a Pringles can that I found in our pantry, and I couldn't see it, so I put on the glasses, and then I took a picture, and then I blew it up, and it said very tiny, I think it said lid. I'll have to look, but anyway, it said one part, I think the container is trash and the lid is recyclable, check locally. But those things, if they were just bigger, I mean, I don't know what percentage of the entire container the recycling information is, but I'm going to guess it's less than 5% or 2%. I know that you want that Coke can to be red all over, and I mean RED, right, the color, but really, couldn't it be 25% of the can? Couldn't it be 30 or 35% of the can? Really, that would answer a lot of our issues, except for language maybe, but that's just my observation.
Thank you, Will. Co-chair Brandon.
yeah, I first wanted to respond to Commissioner Kramer. I think in terms of the use of those smartphones, that's something we kind of have the authority to think about a little bit in terms of what other labeling might need to appear next to it. It could be as something that's, a recommendation for a camera icon or something like that to kind of help instruct how to use use a QR code or something. Like I think there's not universal language or instructions around how to use a QR code in terms of smart labeling yet. And so I think that's something where we could actually offer some interesting recommendations there. And that would be an interesting discussion to have with one of our speakers who's coming in next. And in terms of the size, I think that is absolutely crucial. And I wonder if there's a better metric than percent of the package, right? Because we can have such varying sizes of package. So I don't know if absolute size or pixel count or something like that. I wonder if that's something else we should look into, is whether or not there are standards out there. Dylan, I see you thinking, and I was wondering if APR has something in their guidelines in terms of standards.
I don't think on labeling, because that's designed for the package itself, not the label of the package. There's components of the package that would be on there, but not that. But that is a fair. Maybe we can ask as a follow up to Kim, or perhaps I would look to Dan, maybe if he knows, the task force member Dan Felton, if he knows that.
Are you? I don't want to.
I did. I called on you. I'm sorry.
No,
Dan.
but I know, but I see Nicole's hand up, and so.
Well, I thought it was a direct question, and then we can get to Nicole.
Yeah, and I don't have an answer for you. I may have raised my hand to make a response, but it's not. I don't have an answer specific to your question. So.
Fair enough. Thank you, Nicole.
Yes, I'm just responding to the conversation we're having about QR codes and the use of our smartphone technology. I always go back and think about when I walk into Target, they have places where you can scan and look at information right in the store. So I really think accessibility, we might want to think about some of this money we may get from PROs becomes at the retail for people that may not have cell phones. That might be the easiest. I also think about the current labeling we're talking about and how confusing it is for so many people. I volunteer for a lot of depot events, and people are right, really small on the label, hard to read. So if it becomes universal with the QR code, I think we're going to have much more success with people understanding how to recycle and where to recycle. Thanks.
Thank you. Other questions or commentary around accessibility? Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Dylan. I was only going to make a comment about real estate on labeling, and I know we all know this, but I've got a beverage container in front of me which has a lot of information on it, which has to be on there. And I know we're talking about other information which may have to be on there someday. And I only, in sort of the defense of how much of the label I'm looking at is marketing versus what is, required under some state law or federal requirement for nutrition information, is just to be mindful. It'd be lovely to have 25-30% of a label dedicated to how to recycle. I mean, that's small, how to recycle, not the program, but that there are very real challenges that packaging manufacturers and brand owners have to get everything on a label sometimes, depending on the size of the product. So.
Thank you, Dan. Kristen?
Thank you. So Nicole's comment reminded me, same issue that we talked about internally on accessibility and for the ability to review information before purchase, which I think is relevant when you look at the DOJ language on enforcement under the Uniform Trade Practices Act. Probably didn't get that completely right, but the ability to review the information before purchase as a way to prove up liability. And so I think that's an important point, is to pay attention to even the 15% of people that may not have that technology and ways to do that. And if there do need to be readers in the aisles at stores, then looking for funding to make that happen, so that doesn't fall on the backs of grocers and retailers to get that done. And it also then also just raises my question of, we all completed this particular piece. Are we going to see the surveys that people submitted so we can kind of see how we're aligning on these issues instead of just this compiled information?
I don't know that we captured the names of this one because it was just asking for one word. I would ask Alex maybe to be able to answer that question.
Yes, Chair, we can share this out when we share the information from the straw poll as well.
Right. I don't mean the one word piece. I just mean the information from the straw poll. Did you already share that, Alex, and I missed it?
Not yet. Nope.
Oh, okay. So all of the straw polls that we all completed is what I was actually asking about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so not about accessibility.
About accessibility on second question of the straw poll that we completed, the question was about accessibility. And I assume you took from that information these words to do this slide, but I'd like to see the raw data.
Understood.
Thanks.
Kristen. Anya?
Dan's comment about the other kind of critical piece of information on the packaging label actually inspired me an idea, and I looked it up, and there are FDA standards for font and font size for nutrition information on packaging. And so I can share this with task force members, this link that I found after our call. But I wonder if that is an interesting kind of jumping off point that we should consider for that size issue of setting at least a minimum in terms of font size and pieces like that.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm not saying that those pieces are always readable, because they do seem small still, of course.
It depends on the size of the container too, I suppose. So if you could share that with Alex, that's great. We can compile that into the list of research. Before we get to our Q&A with our experts, who I believe are on the line, are there any other kind of considerations of accessibility that you would like compiled. Again, Kristen, you'll have the data from the straw person polls in its raw form, so you can maybe triangulate where you see that alignment. I think there is a great deal of alignment just by looking at the size of these words, which means that those are repeated by various task force members and responding to that. Any other thoughts or considerations?
I would just add one piece here that we didn't quite get to in this discussion, but clearly came up a lot in this discussion is the language access and just how important it is for everyone in our state to be able to access information. Knowing how precious space is on a label already, really hard to imagine fitting in recycling information in 5-10 different languages. So I wonder, as we think about some of our smart labeling and the conversation we're about to have with our experts there, what that lens of accessibility could also entail in terms of, other languages you could provide access to that I know Kim already spoke about in her video.
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised that and captured that, co-chair Brandon. I think that's very important because again, given 5 to 10 languages that we could conceivably put on there, that smart labeling technology seems to be a solution that may be able to grapple with that. So appreciate you raising that. Okay. Are there any other thoughts before we move on to our Q&A? And I'll ask our experts to come on camera. Great. Hi, Kim, and we have our experts, Kim Holmes from 4R Sustainability, Patrick Krieger, if you can turn your camera on, with the Plastics Industry Association, and Steve Alexander, President and CEO of the Association of Plastic Recyclers. And I think Steve texted me earlier and said that he's having some camera challenges, so he may be off camera for this part of the session. So all of you received the videos of our interviews with our experts. Thank you to all of our experts for your time and expertise that you shared with us. And we wanted to take this time to give you all, task force members, the chance to ask questions of these experts while we're here. I have a question myself, but I got all the questions in live, so I want to leave this open. So if you wouldn't mind raising your hand so we can order you, and then you can dig in with Kim, Patrick, and Steve. Well, maybe I'll get folks started and help you rev your engines. So this question is for Kim. So in a likely future in which a great deal of communication regarding product recyclability is provided virtually, like a smart label or instead of printed on pack, truth in labeling standards might need to apply to internet content, not just printed content. So I wanted to ask if you're aware if California's SB 343 addresses, quote, virtual content, kind of regulating internet speech as well as printed content, or just printed content alone. And, from a legal perspective, does that kind of regulating of virtual content via smart label pose any challenges that regulation of printed labeling doesn't? So, essentially, is truth in labeling going to be harder when we kind of move to this sort of this virtual labeling, or is it captured under current statute? And just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on this, Kim.
Great, thanks. Well, these certainly are just my thoughts and no sort of formal legal opinion. So please run it by whatever lawyers are there at DQ. But in my understanding, so in California, SB 343, it also does state that it's unlawful to make environmental marketing claims. And so it doesn't just pertain to the claims that are put on pack. And that language is consistent with what's in the FTC guidelines around making environmental claims, largely captured in the green guides. So I think that's an example of where policy and regulation has been constructed in a really smart way, that it doesn't govern the vehicle for messaging and information. It basically just says whatever information, however you put it out there, needs to be accurate and truthful and not deceptive. So I would imagine yeah, by extension, the fact that the package has a symbol directing you to the information electronically, that by extension, it's governed by the green guides.
Thank you, Kim. Patrick, it looks like you were coming off on mute. Did you have you wanted to weigh in on that too? Oh no, okay, gotcha. Kristen, go right ahead.
Thank you. I thought the discussion really was fascinating, Kim. So thanks for working on that and giving that presentation. I haven't had a chance to completely review the slides since I printed them off, but I think there's a lot of information there too that I'd like to just kind of go through, and I may, hitch up later with more questions after I've had a chance to do that. But I thought I heard you say for the QR codes research, or maybe it was, what's the other name? The one where everything is imprinted throughout the
digital watermark.
Thank you. The Consumer Brands Association is lead on one of those for more information about the research or what's being done.
Yeah, so the Consumer Brands Association has the whole Smart Label initiative. And I don't know if like the digital presentation you were provided, if those links worked or not, but I could get you that specifically. It's my understanding that I don't believe they like stipulate or have picked a single platform for smart labeling. QR code seems to be the predominant one. Again, I think simply because people are most familiar with that, and that QR function is native in most iPhones. And so that's, I think, the predominant platform, but I think it would function with other types of smart labeling systems.
And thank you. I'll take a look at that link too and see if it's there. The cost of devices was a question, and I don't think there was an answer on that about what the cost would be related to like putting QR code reading devices in retail locations or in other ones. Does somebody else have that information, or did I just miss it in the presentation?
So for an individual consumer, really the only tool that you need is your handheld phone. So any phone with a camera, or the ability to download an app if you're not using a QR code. So, I think those vary widely. Sometimes they're free, depending on how long of a term of contract you want to pick up with somebody. For a recycler, like if they wanted to integrate a digital watermark detection unit, that is going to vary based on technology manufacturer. But the idea is that you could get those added on as an add-on unit initially before you kind of upgraded your full NIR detection unit for less than the cost of a new detection unit. And so I think, in the presentation, I mentioned that Tomer and Palenque are working on commercializing those units. So they're working out the, actual costs of those now. But the idea is that it would be less than the cost of a full NIR unit at this time.
So back to the other piece, though, on the consumer facing piece, which would be the QR code at a store and another location. I think part of the conversation from your presentation was we don't have Oregon specific data on who has a smartphone in Oregon versus what we know nationally from the Pew study of 85% in 2020. And it goes also, I think, to Commissioner Kramer's point of we may have differences of urban versus rural. So I would be curious more on, I think, if 15% of people don't have that option, then I think that that's a big enough percentage that we should be thinking about how to make that accessible for all Oregonians who are, consumers. So that would be my question.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I would say that it's, not just cell phones that can pick these up, your iPads, other sort of tablet readers. And it probably, to enable that functionality for the consumer at the retail location probably wouldn't be much different than those units that some stores like Target and Walmart have where you can price check in the aisle.
Exactly.
Right? So out of curiosity, you could just say, I wonder if I brought this package home, if it would be recyclable. Something similar to that. So
okay. Thank you.
Tom, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair Dillon. Question about the RIC. And there was a pretty good discussion, I think, with Patrick and Steve's session about the RIC and the challenges with molds and changing and adopting different RICs in different areas. If I recall correctly, the SB 343 out of California is going to require plastics that are not meet their standard definition of recyclability to not include the RIC as we see it today. And if that is the case, do we know what the new resin code needs to look like? And does that meet kind of the rigors of not including the recycling symbols on it? And how is industry reacting to that in terms of the internalizing those impacts that you guys discussed?
I'll direct that question to Patrick. Patrick, can you answer that question?
Yeah, so at a high level, SB 343 just says that the number needs to not be inside chasing arrows, right? So that's not necessarily the RIC, that's the old SPI resin ID code that has been codified in regulations. The current ASTM resin ID code is a solid triangle. So to understand that, it sounds like a weird thing to be quibbling about, but it's an important nuance to talk about. So the California rule does not preclude the use of a resin ID code, just the chasing arrows. Now, the challenge is that in many other states, we do already have that. We do already have the requirement that we use a chasing arrows. So the industry right now is grappling with that and trying to figure out the best way to do that. There's no common consensus right now. I mean, for a lot of reasons, right? Like, we're not all just gonna come together and make these decisions collectively, but what we're trying to do is find that solution on how we solve a problem that exists currently without having to do it multiple times.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, and thank you, Patrick. Kristen, you had another question? You're on mute, Kristen.
I clicked it and it just didn't change. So thank you. Thanks, Patrick. And I also thought that was a really interesting session between you and Steve. So I appreciate the time that you took to put into that as well. I did have some similar questions on the RIC. I think everybody in this room and every vote indicates that everyone understands the RIC code is important and needs to stay. I think when we talk about it, though, we think about that as the number, not necessarily within the chasing arrow symbol, which of course is the problem that continues in the 36 other states that you mentioned as well in that conversation. And you did talk about being very aware of that being a legacy of SPI and your organization as well, and the understanding of statutory timelines and efforts to make changes to that. And willingness to update. And I know Steve specifically Steve Alexander said he'd like to be a part of those updates and conversations. And I just like to take this moment to say, so would I, if that's a possibility, to know what the efforts are in the conversations to correct the problems that exist here in much of the reason, because the RIC code with the chasing arrows isn't used in the way that it was intended. It's used as an educational tool for recycling, or at least people think of it that way. They look at it and think that means recyclability versus what an RIC code means to a plastic processor. I know that our association and the people that we work with would be very curious about the efforts being made and the timelines expected from your organization to fix those things. So just throwing it out there, and would love more information.
Yeah, we're happy to keep people updated on that process as we're going. Right now, we're kind of in that point where we're at plastics. You know, we have a very large number of members because we represent the full plastics industry in the United States. And so we are doing that very rigorous process of checking to make sure that we are collecting the feedback from across the diverse needs and demands of the supply chain. So once we have that, and the recycling partnership and other associations are definitely going to be involved in these conversations. Plastics does not want to do this alone. We can't do this alone. We want to make sure that there's kind of that collective will. And so we're happy to kind of keep you updated and let you know when we're getting to the point where we're kind of doing that collaboration. But you're exactly right. Yeah, we're happy to have that kind of input.
So if you're got a timeline in mind, you know, what are you thinking here for a timeline to deal with the correction? Because it's not only the you need to take away the requirement to have the chasing arrows with the RIC code in those 36 states, but it also needs to look at the ATSM standard that requires instead now a triangle, which really is probably no less confusing than the other piece for some. And now you've got California doing other things. So just curious on your timelines, because I think that would be informative to this group as we talk about suggestions back to the legislature and providing sufficient timelines for groups such as yours to correct these issues.
Yeah, so what I would say is that so plastics, speaking solely as plastics, resolving this as soon as possible is really important to us to give everybody sufficient amount of time. I would love to be able to start having these conversations. So I would love to have some as resolution as early as, you know, the fall or into early next year. The challenge is as you get more people involved, obviously these things move a little slower. So making sure that there's that balance between making sure that we're getting sufficient feedback and consensus and kind of the moving forward as quickly as possible, because you're right. Like once we understand what we have to do, then you actually have to go and do that. And that takes a lot of time, especially, I don't know if any of you have been active at an ASTM standard. That takes a lot of time to do. So trying to find those solutions and then trying to get those in place is a very high priority for the association.
Thanks,
Okay, well,
Patrick.
that's good timelines. I mean, this fall or closing in on the springtime early. It's good to hear. So please let us know how we can participate and assist and even offer more support for that. Thank you.
Awesome.
Task Force Member Will, go right ahead.
Thank you. Patrick, thank you for that information. I appreciate all you've done as well. I'm curious about the in a very quick answer is fine, but how they went from a triangle of chasing arrows to just a triangle. I echo and thought of this issue before. Kristen brought it up as well, and it's something that I've thought about for a while. Is there a need to keep the triangle? It just seems like, as I'll refer to again, everybody's eyes going bad slowly. When you turn the bottle over and take a quick glance, because that's all anyone's really going to do, it looks really similar. Are they stuck with the triangle? Can they do anything else? And I don't recommend a circle. Just curious about that, because I think and has there been any pushback on why is it so similar? Thank you.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And obviously there are a lot of diverse opinions in the industry about that, you know, and not necessarily representative of everybody, but a lot of people have that question about are those two substantially different? I believe Steve mentioned in his presentation that they have information that most consumers don't feel the difference, that there's a significant difference between the two. I don't want to represent somebody else's data, so I'd really hope that Steve could clarify that. But what I would say is that also many of those conversations started happening a very long time ago, much like when we were talking about getting things fixed. So I think that going from a chasing arrows to a triangle is a pragmatic solution, because it's easy to turn, you know, those chasing arrows into a solid triangle, or it's potentially easier. And that was kind of the hope, because, you know, I think they were hoping that they could just do a quick retrofit on a lot of these molds. Again, that many of these conversations started in the 90s. The standard didn't change until late 2010s or late 2020s rather. But on top of that, one of the other pieces of feedback that we've always heard is it's kind of like using a red pen to grade. And then, you know, when kids are like, oh, you can't use a red pen because now they've associated red with criticism. Whatever symbol and code that we use is going to be confusing unless we are doing the education on what it's intended to do, and you know, make sure that our messages are very clear and consistent across the industry on this. Like whatever we use, it could very easily become confusing if we don't also do the work of informing, you know, the end user on how to dispose of the product at the end of use.
Right. And what about just no border at all, just a number?
Well, I would say that a lot of companies are already using just numbers and number systems for internal mold tracking or systems tracking. So no symbology is also very difficult. Yeah, you got to kind of find that balance.
Thank you.
Steve, Steve Alexander was kind of referenced there. I would love to hear him chime in, and then we're over time for our Q&A, but Kristen, it looks like you have one more follow-up. So Steve, can you answer the last question, and then we'll go to Kristen.
Oh, you know, I mean, basically the recyclers, we need a code. We need to be able to determine what the composition of the container is. And we've always needed a code. Unfortunately, you know, the code was hijacked and we're way beyond that. We recognized there was a problem beginning in about 93, 94, when we started to see material that was not supposed to be on the code starting to contaminate our stream. So, you know, I would just say I think there was an opportunity in the ASTM process, which really was just driven by a very small number of people without a broad-based discussion. And as Patrick pointed out, if you know anything about the ASTM and that process, it can be driven by a very small number of people. And we were at that point very concerned about just the transition and ASTM coming out that way, because they had no intention of trying to go around and change the law in all the other states, and they had no regulatory enforcement, which really mandates people operating under enforcement discretion, which frankly they do when they use the code, because the code as it is utilized today is in fact illegal. It's not compliant with the way that the code is set up, and it's not compliant in the way it's law in 38 states. But I think, you know, I think Patrick has outlined that this is an extremely complex issue, but I think it's important to remember there are two distinct audiences here. I don't think we should confuse a resident identification code with a consumer education program. And I think that distinction needs to be clear, and we need to do whatever we can to enforce it. You know, you've heard me say, I don't care what the code is, as long as there's a code. And I mean, you've got, you know, Nicole Jansen is on this call. You all know Nicole. I'm sure she has fairly strong opinions, but we use that code more today than we did in 1988, 1989. 1988 and 89, we were looking at PET and high density for the most part. Today, we've got multi-label, multi-laminate type, multi-material containers. We desperately need a code to help us make sure that we can sort the product appropriately, and we can process it with its appropriate brethren. So it's important to get this right. But again, the key point that I want to make, and I apologize for going on, is that I think we need to look at this as two distinct activities. One is a resident identification code, and the other needs to be a consumer education type activity, which to me comes down to labeling.
Thank you, Steve. Well put. Nice, robust answer. Kristen, go ahead.
I couldn't agree more with Steve. I think, you know, continuing the point of, we agree that the processors need a code, but it needs to be different than confusing consumers about what's recyclable. And along those lines, one of the things we'd suggested was you say RIC1, RIC2, or you could even do PP5, HDPE2, you know, use letters, English letters. English is the international language of business. You could do it that way to make it clear what it is without any sort of symbol attached to it. So I agree with that. And I think there are ways to solve that. And if the process is difficult through the ATSM, then maybe there's a way to, I don't know, circumvent or look at a different approach to that as well. I don't know the answer to that, but I know what it's like when you feel like you've got 5 people that are speaking for 500 sometimes. So the other question I had just briefly with Patrick, and thanks for the indulgence, is you said in your presentation that on a question how long molds could last, and they could last decades, which I think was a surprising answer to a lot of us that were listening. And I'm just curious, is there an average amount of time that a mold lasts? Is there something more than it could last a decade, but it really lasts about 18 months? Or is there some kind of a range there?
So properly managed, it's decades for anything. So the average is high, right? These are expensive pieces of precision equipment that we put and we develop, and we want to use them as much as possible. The thing that wears them down is essentially use. And so obviously, if they are used more, if they are improperly maintained, if they are being used with products that can corrode them over time, that does lower their kind of cycle use and their life cycle. But yeah, an average mold can last a very, very long time, in the tens of years.
Okay, thank you. So that's good to know for turning them as far as expense and timing. Thank you.
Task Force Member Maya, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of confirm that having a background in some industry related to mold making, I've worked with glass, and I know that that is the case. So these metal molds that are blown into, they could, I mean, conceivably they could last longer than decades if used correctly. So they, unless you have to swap them out for design, which granted, I would guess a lot of large scale producers don't have any problem doing that. And, it's worth it to them. So it's just a question of where people want to spend their money. Not that it's impossible to do it, but they really could last a very long time.
Thank you. All right, terrific. This has been a really great Q&A. I hope that the task force members found the videos valuable and this Q&A time valuable. If you have follow-up questions that will influence your decision as we move forward in honing our proposals, I heartily recommend you reach out to each of these members. They all are these experts. Each of them has offered their time beyond the recording and this Q&A to be able to answer questions. And again, I just want to thank all of you. Thank Kim, Patrick, and Steve for taking the time to spend with us today. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Steve. And if you are able to hang on, if there are questions that come up during the presentations, that's fantastic. If not, then we'll follow up via email. All right, with that, I'm going to go back to sharing the slides and we'll get into the meat of today's meeting, which is the presentation. We went considerably over time for this part of the dialogue, but it was obviously very important to get through these questions and get the answers from the experts. So with that, I wanted to highlight what our next steps are before we get into those. We have 3 meetings left after this meeting. The next meeting is meeting number 6, where we're going to be editing our proposals, so further honing, but hopefully finalizing the proposal so we can begin the hard work of writing the actual report, which we then will have to work on and edit. So we have, these are the meetings that are set up. We may end up doing meetings in between these meetings, which we will make available to all task force members per the request from Kristen earlier today. But we are going to obviously have to have these, we have to start cutting these down. We're going to have to pull this as we can get to a decision so we can start writing that report, because the final meeting was meeting number 8, which will be finalizing that report and doing those next steps. So I just wanted to keep that in the back of everyone's mind as we are working our way through the proposals. Wanted to share this again. This was the note that we shared with everyone when we were sharing the proposals out with the group, which is from both myself and Vice Chair Brandon. And that, the idea was that we adjusted the proposal following the discussion and the feedback that we talked about at the last task force meeting, as well as the straw person voting that we saw. We wanted to create a proposal that we believed would comply with the 36 now states, because 3 states have adjusted their legislation. The 36 states that currently require chasing arrows around the resin identification code, but would also comply with SB 343. And we believe that reflects both the task force consensus of an expressed desire for clear recyclability claims that would not confuse consumers, but also address accessibility considerations for most Oregonians. And then I shared that Pew Research mobile, which I know we had some conversation about earlier. So with that, wanted to put forward this proposal, which we took to vote, and we'll share those responses with everyone, is that if there are chasing arrows through on a package, to require strike through for items not on Oregon's uniform statewide collection list. So this would potentially mandate a RIC to be changed if it had a chasing arrows around it, but was not on the USCL. on the list that will be developed from the 582 process. This would, we believe, would not be in arrears of those 36 states because they do not say that they can't put a line through if there are chasing arrows through it. So we thought that was an adjustment that would be welcomed by the task force. And then the reiteration of this of mandating embedded consumer facing, and that was some language that we changed so that way it was clearer, recyclability labeling via commonly used smart labeling technology, and of course providing time for packaging producers to prepare for any changes to be adopted. And even though this is already integrated into the system, we did want to highlight that there would be an on-ramp for new materials, though again, there is already an on-ramp in the 582, the Recycling Modernization Act. So as we went through this, these are what the proposal was. We found that there were 6 task force members that supported as is, 4 that could support with changes, which we'll get into in a moment. 2 were uncertain, none opposed, and then 1 opposed but could support with changes. And the list of the, actually they were alphabetical, but apparently they were not. So the names that were there in the list are not reflective of where they voted. So wanted to open this up for conversation and discussion. We will go through all 4 proposals, including the ORA proposal, which is last, as well as the voting, but would love to hear from the could support with changes or the oppose but could support with changes, and see what changes that you would like to discuss. And if you are one of the supporters or uncertain, certainly chime in. Dan, go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dylan. And the issue Ameripan has is with the mandate on the smart labeling technology. We'd be more comfortable if it were something like support, encourage, I mean, I think we're going to get there someday, but again, it's the rub is that word mandate to absolutely must have that versus find a way to encourage that, find a way to drive that forward. Perhaps there's a couple different ways that can be done, but that's our issue with trying to find a way to get to support this proposal number 1.
Do you have some, I'm sorry, I have a quick follow-up question. Do you have some thoughts as to like what would, what some language that we could, kind of push that forward if it weren't a mandate and you did want to put something in statute that would support and encourage that? And then if you don't have it currently, that might be an ask to bring back to the group.
Well, I can give you one example and I think we may have previously mentioned this, we do see this as an area that could be potentially ripe for eco-modulation, so that if someone wants to reduce their fees, or strive to reduce their fees, the use of this type of technology could be a good carrot for them, if you will. So
great. Thank you, Dan. Nicole?
Thanks, Dylan. The one question that I just really felt with this proposal number 1, and one of the reasons I couldn't support as is requiring the strike through for items not on Oregon's uniform statewide collection list. I've talked to quite a few people that do packaging, and I'm getting feedback from people saying, they may choose not to have a package if it's too much work in cost to come in, and maybe somebody else has a reflection of feedback I'm getting directly from people who are making packaging, because I'm just asking people what they think about this. And the fact that there's not something about, I felt like we've been talking about having it reflect what California is doing, potentially Washington, and just to have Oregon's uniform statewide list with the strike through, I'm not totally comfortable with that language. So that's kind of where my viewpoint came from.
I had a quick follow-up there. When you say sure, at the outset where you said that they would not use that package, are you meaning that they wouldn't sell into the state? Is that,
I had people say if it costs too much to change molds or things like that, and mind you, huge brand companies are probably going to be fine with it, but I'm talking to small, medium-sized businesses that feel like it just might be too much of a burden, and they may have to change either not selling a product or having something, I don't know, it could reflect on cost for our consumers if they have less choices potentially.
Thank you, Task Force Member Jansen. Appreciate that clarification. Task Force Member Miller, go ahead.
There we go. Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think, I put number 2 as well. A lot of it was similar to Dan's concerns on that word mandate in the second bullet. I think the word that came to mind when I thought what could change that word is the word incentivize. Dan used eco-modulation as an example. I think you could incentivize this smart labeling technology in a way that just doesn't go as far as a mandate. And so I think that was the reason I put number 2.
Thank you. Task Force Member Bulow? Maya?
Sorry. Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, I had originally, I thought I had maybe supported this one. I don't see my name there though. And I would say from a practical standpoint, just after having heard some of the comments on making molds, changing molds, and thinking about how the strike through might function with with the chasing arrows and the numbers, I do have a concern, like depending on how tiny those are, that the strike through would actually cover the number, which, I mean, I don't know. Granted, that's that's probably a problem that the producers will have to deal with, but it could be tricky. Yeah, that's all. Just a little thought.
Thank you. Task Force Member Mitchell?
Thanks. So my support with changes, I think a couple of things, well, a number of things. First of all, provide time for packaging producers to prepare for any changes to be adopted. I think that should be overall, not just as a sub point under mandate embedded labeling. That's an issue that I think speaks to forms, it speaks to molds, it speaks to the technology related to do these things. All of those things will require time, and I think we should provide that time to allow that to happen, which also may soften the blow for mandated labeling or having the chasing arrows change on a mold. For one of the things we thought about, so that's an overall comment. The chasing arrows on the package with the strike through, our group talked about that and originally felt supportive of it, but then talked more about really why we're here in the first place, which is confused customers. And are we going to confuse them more by putting this kind of labeling on some packaging? For example, things that would potentially be on the USCL code that are list that not commingled, right? But for special events could be things like maybe cartons at a take back, or possibly plastic wrap at a grocery store. And if those materials which are recyclable in those forms are now noted as not recyclable in Oregon, then I think it maybe raises more questions with consumers, causes more problems than it solves. And then you have the issues of readability and is it possible to, find this? So we look at this from, you're better off to say nothing on a package like that than you are to indicate it's not recyclable, when in fact it could be, even though it's not recyclable under the USCL. And so that was a concern for us on that bullet point. And then finally, on the on-ramp for new materials, that just is really not within our purview. That is a piece that is going to be dealt with through the Senate Bill 582 RMA piece, the USCL group that is currently meeting to talk about the technical requirements for a material to be on the list. And I don't think it's appropriate for this group to be discussing on-ramps for new or not. That's their work, not our work. And let's let them do their job, and we'll just stick to ours, which is the labeling. Thanks.
Thank you, Task Force Member Mitchell. Task Force Member Larman?
So Kristen stole part of mine, which I'm bothered by. But the on-ramp, off-ramp issue, I think they should both be noted when either is used, because it is supposedly a dynamic process. There will be times as technology changes or other things happen where products could be added there. It's then also possible for products to be work their way off the uniform statewide collection list. And so But I also agree with Kristen that this isn't really within the main focus of the truth in labeling aspect. I mean, we know the list is going to happen, and we know we have to talk about it, but I don't know that it needs to be a bullet here in our proposal.
Thank you, Task Force Member Larmouth. Other questions from the folks who could support with changes, or opposed but could support with changes? And before we move on to the next one. Okay. Oh, yes, go ahead, Will. Sorry, Task Force Member Postgate. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you. I just have might be a question for an expert here, but I think a couple of meetings ago we had kind of a confusion between labels and packaging, where we might have gotten a little mixed up because people were saying, well, changing packaging is really hard, and then someone said, well, changing the label is no big deal. So how much of, I get that the chasing arrows on plastic oftentimes is part of the mold, but is there a way to make it the label itself the strike through? Is that easier? I guess I'm trying to make sure that we're on the same page there, because labels are different than the package itself, and if we can do something with the label that is easier than changing, at least temporarily until they figure out the mold, is that a step forward, right? That's my question.
So the top bullet was on package, because that was referring to the RIC, and the RIC is required on package, not on label. So that kind of answers that question. I mean, labeling, my understanding, and again, I would look to Dan to be able to when my working with brands companies, changing a label is certainly not impossible, but does follow the same sort of supply chain challenges, not as intense as the molds that we're talking about, but at the same time, changing a label does incur costs and does take time for them to adjust and change and run through their pieces. But it is remarkably much simpler than doing those molds, is my understanding. Dan, would you add anything to that before we go to Task Force Member Bulow again?
Just to agree with you, Dylan.
Okay, thank you. Task Force Member Bulow, you had another question?
Yes, thanks. I just wanted to speak to that same issue, which I had actually also been thinking about, but thought I might save the comment till we get to the slides based on not kind of the status quo plus. So this, I think, skips ahead a little bit to think based on the QR and smart phone conversation and the packaging, like labeling conversation, that using maybe within the status quo plus, we could add an additional proposal if it's not too late in the game, which involves, kind of a do nothing with the RIC and launch a more wide or a more intensive education campaign around consumer education now only being on packaging, like maybe just a very simple one stroke kind of educational campaign that is like, do not reference the RIC, everyone. Bullhorn, I don't know. I guess maybe that's something that on that slide, the status quo plus, we could come circle back around, and I'll try and remember to speak up at that time and we could vote on it.
Thank you. Yes, I added that to my notes, and I do want to chime in as we've been talking about the RIC, and sort of what a lot of folks are saying, but I'm sorry, we're not really saying, we're kind of talking around a little bit, is there are lots of items that we're talking about that have the chasing arrows item that are not required to do so. So that top bullet does kind of get at that on pack. But that only, is the 36 states and apply only to rigid plastic. So we are talking about a larger kind of universe of things with chasing arrows on it. So I did want to just kind of chime in and state that as we move forward. And again, we'll be able to bounce back and forth through these proposals, but let's get through all 4 of them so we can have that conversation, and then we can start honing them a bit. Really good dialogue so far. So the second proposal is actually an add-on to 1, so it's 1B. And the idea behind this is that there would be establish a threshold for requiring do not recycle And so that, for items that are not on the USCL and not considered recyclable in California, or not able to be labeled as recyclable in California, the threshold could be set as below, say, 30 to 50% recycling acceptance rates, for example. Now, just as a key, that this proposal requires a do not recycle label, as opposed to the RIC component of that first proposal, which only applies to manufacturers that elect to choose chasing arrows. So they're a little bit different. This is a bit more rigorous. And so we had straw poll results. We had 4 that could support as is, 3 that could support with changes, 3 were uncertain, 3 opposed, and then none on that opposed but could support with changes. And there were 3 of us that said that they could support with changes. I'll just say for my own and get through it really quick, is my changes were about the thresholds and wanting to make sure that those thresholds were based on data and that we would be able to, adjust that consideration. So I would argue it would be X% to X%, and then based on some sort of consideration as to what those percentage should be, that would be mine. But for other task force members that could support with changes, or others that wanted to comment, wanted to give you time to comment about that. Task force member Miller or task force member Felton.
Dylan, yeah, I would, our position on that was similar to yours about the threshold. So that's kind of where we were landing on that, trying to understand that.
Thank you, Task Force Member Felton. Task Force Member Miller.
Yeah, and mine as well. I mean, we were just wanting to understand the, anything less than or equal to 60%, because of Senate Bill 343. And so I think that, I think that falls in line with what you just said. As for I will say for the first bullet, the do not recycle, we were just, I did have a comment that wondering if we could reference an approved third-party labeling program. How to recycle is one of them in that particular bullet. And so, but we weren't opposed. It was just one of those things of referencing that. But other than that, I think just the same concern about the threshold.
Thank you. Oh, yes. Co-Chair Brandon, go right ahead.
Yeah, I would just say, I think going from somewhat arbitrary numbers that I have here to, really data-driven threshold would make total sense, and is absolutely the right path forward for something. The idea here being not wanting to put this label on something that's collected at, say, 55% and is about to hit that 60% threshold and make it onto the list, but really targeting and ensuring that there's clear do not recycle labeling on, if we think back to our Venn diagram slide on, a lot of those items that were in the outside, that purple category, your multi-material films, things like that we know are currently not recycled and are not going to appear on this list, even with time. So was the thinking behind this. But I totally agree with coming up with a more data-driven threshold and number there.
Thank you, Co-Chair Branton. Task Force Member Mitchell.
Thank you. So even a 60% recyclable in Oregon means 40% of the time it's not. So how does this help with the issues we have about confusing customers and making sure they have better information about what's truly recyclable on their labels?
I'll take a first stab at it and then go to Co-Chair Branton. That this would be on the materials that are well below that threshold, and the idea is that those are close to a threshold, may not be able to be labeled as recyclable in California. Again, what problem are we trying to solve if something is not labeled as recyclable, as it will not be able to in the future after 343 compliance? but rather this is a very clear delineation of what is not recyclable. So do not recycle for things that are unlikely to be on-ramped in the future. So this is really just adding an additional threshold, Task Force Member Mitchell, on those items that are very unlikely in the short term or the medium term or even the long term of potentially getting on that list. So that way it's a direct on those pieces as opposed to on all items where there may be confusion, to your point, that is close or something along those lines. That would be my thought. Go ahead, Co-Chair Brandon.
Yeah, the only piece I would add there is that, as we discussed before, we are here because we as a task force are assembled because there has been such a historic issue with labeling and recyclability claims. And so we are not making any of these proposals in a vacuum, despite the clear different future we are heading in, given 343 and 582 here in Oregon. So just kind of given that there has been so much historic misinformation on labels and recyclability claims, kind of establishing a threshold to help eliminate some of the lowest hanging fruit in terms of contamination in the system.
Task Force Member Felton. Thank you, Co-Chair Brandon.
Yeah, thank you, Dylan. I just want to point something out too, that if we're talking about threshold, and California is a perfect example. There are two different thresholds in the new California law. Are we talking about access to recycling, which I assume that number down there, 30 to 50% recycling acceptance, meaning, at curbside, let's say 25% are only accepting a particular material versus the actual recycling rate. So where Kristen said, yeah, 60%, there's 40% not getting recycled. I think we're talking about two different things. We could have an access rate of 60%, and the actual recycling rate of a given material could be 80%. So I just want to make sure we're talking in the same nomenclature here on access versus actual recycling rate.
Thank you, Task Force Member Felton. I read this as that access, the acceptance, not the recycling rate. That was how I read it in that. Okay.
Can you just give me an example of how that would work? Just like pick a material and explain this one to me, because I'm just missing it.
Sure. I will use my favorite prop, which is this cone, this aluminum cone. This is only accepted in 5% of California communities. So this aluminum cone is not going to be allowed to have recyclability labeling. It also is kind of heavy, so it really messes up recycling equipment. So this is not going to be labeled as recyclable. It also is below that threshold. So it's only accepted at 5%. So it's a really small number. Under this proposal, this would be required to state somewhere on this cone that it says do not recycle, as opposed to, say, this Bluetooth speaker, which is not recyclable as well. But let's play this around. This is a material that is close to being accepted. This would be at a 50% recycling acceptance. This also won't be able to be labeled as recyclable, but it's close. And maybe with investment, this Bluetooth speaker will potentially be able to get onto the list. And so it will not be on the USCL. It would not be able to be labeled currently as recyclable, but maybe with some additional investment, these Bluetooth speakers are able to get into the curbside system. And so therefore it's given that additional chance to be able to get onto it, that it wouldn't be sort of tarred for all time with that do not recycle piece, where it would then be challenging to get over that. Again, this is a reflection of the changing material stream as it is evolving itself, and allows for producers to comply in the future without dooming something for all time to say do not recycle, which is then really going to provide a barrier to be able to get into that. Does that answer your question?
It does, but I guess it doesn't change really how I'm thinking about this, which is you're talking about an issue that is going to be resolved at a different group, right? The USCL is going to make those decisions in Oregon about what's recyclable in Oregon and what's going to make the list, and adding do not recycle labeling to these items. And instead of using your cone, let's just go back to, let's say, plastic wrap that can go to a grocery store or something like that. Sure. Once again, if you put a do not recycle label on it, in that case, then you do mislead consumers in some ways, because they could take it back to their grocery store into their current system and they couldn't. And they're going to look at that and go, well, now I can't recycle it at all. So I don't see how this fixes the problem about confusion. I don't see how it reaches the majority of people. And I still don't think it solves the problem we're here to solve, which is trying to reduce the confusion for consumers.
And I would argue, again, Task Force Member Mitchell, that this is a component of that other piece. This is a subset to there, and that if something there is a drop-off component to the California 343 process as well in the UCSL. So I think it would actually answer that drop-off component that would not say do not recycle for something like that, because it would potentially be in that threshold. Or we can even add language that would say that if there's a drop-off threshold that you could do that. Again, this is a proposal, a straw person proposal that we are here to edit and change. So that may be a way that would not lead to that consumer confusion that you're alluding to. Task Force Member Felton.
Yeah, sorry. I just also want to clarify that what you just mentioned in California, that is when you hear me say a bifurcated standard. So the curbside standard in California is a 60% access rate. The standard for materials and films is a great example. Bags collected at alternative drop-off methods, store drop-off or alternative collection, store drop-off being a good example of that, is not 60% access. It's actually, believe it or not, a 60% recycling rate that goes up eventually to 75%. So that's why I'm making the point about this, because in California, they've taken a different approach depending on how the material is recycled.
Well put, and maybe some wordsmithing around there could actually address those concerns. So, because certainly we would not want to confuse consumers per Task Force Member Mitchell's comments. I'm going to move to those other pieces because I want to be able to get to the rest of this before we get to changes. So Task Force Member Mitchell, can I please move to the next slide, or do you need to talk about this one?
I would just say we do really need to resolve that language between accessibility and recycling rate, because I think it's confusing. So at some point, we're going to have to spend more time on that. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so proposal number 2, this is a pretty simple proposal, and I would suggest that this is not meant to be in a vacuum, that it would just be this, it would not be the other things. So these are 2 recommendations that we could have in the report to the pro. The future pro that has not yet been chosen here for the Recycling Modernization out here in Oregon, that the 2 recommendations that we saw wide support is that pros would run a statewide ad campaign to teach Oregonians about label changes, and to potentially use eco-modulation to support recycling label best practices. As an example, there are some EPR systems globally that give a bonus for companies that use a particular threshold or type of recycling label, size, some of the pieces that we have been talking about today in terms of, clarity, size, etc. We could suggest to the pro make those recommendations as part of their eco-modulation moving forward. This had an overwhelming amount of support to have these suggestions. There were 8 that supported as is, 1 that could support with some changes, none that were uncertain, 1 that opposed, and then 3 that opposed but could support with changes. And so wanted to offer time to those 4 that could support with changes. Commissioner Kramer, Task Force Member Larmouth, Mitchell, and Posgate. Please chime in if you want to say your piece.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the big picture. Thank you, Dylan. Is that that at some point we've got to involve local government as well in this, with labeling or with education. I think that's a big piece as we move forward, because sometimes it's easier for me to educate my folks than it is to have a big company come in and try to do the same. So, I think there's still room to talk about this as we move forward, but there still needs to be some local decision-making in these campaigns.
Thank you, Commissioner Kramer. And Task Force Member Mitchell.
Thank you. So I would say from the perspective of Aura, both of these points are supportable, that the PROs run the statewide ad campaigns to teach Oregonians about label changes, and also using ecomodulation to support better labeling practices. But also both of those things are already existing in 582. And the pros doing statewide ad campaigns, if it's going to be done, it should be done pursuant to what's existing in 582, which speaks to what Commissioner Kramer just said. That includes local government input and what the ad campaigns would look like. That includes review by the ORSAC committee that is coming into play starting in May, that will be setting up to have exactly those conversations, that will also be looking at the ecomodulation pieces for all of those things. So once again, this is a piece that already exists in 582, and while they're good points, I think maybe those are points that if we're looking at narrowing our report based on timing and everything else, it could be something that we know these are important, but we also note that they already exist in current new law in the RMA. The other piece and is a process piece, and that is that this proposal is recommendations to the PROs versus a report that is written to the legislature, which is the goal and the purpose for us to be here. So I would object to it being a recommendation to the PRO and suggest that if we were going to talk about it, we'd be talking about it in the report that we send to the legislature.
Thank you. Sorry, I would just say that there were, while this is in 582, there were some specific pieces that were not outlined in 582, and that's why we said recommendations to the pro. And some of this was the thought that there could be some good, robust recommendations that came out of this that allowed for direction for that important next steps. And given that there is that reviewability and that connection to the local government, as well as to the ORSAC, to your point, which will come together, that we thought that was a good natural way for the task force to interact with it. And it seems that the overwhelming majority, did support that. So anyway, just a grace note there to add. Are there other thoughts or considerations for folks that could support with changes? And if not, I would move on to the proposal number 3. Terrific. Okay. So proposal number 3 is that future status quo plus. So a task force member Bulow, I think you can get ready to chat because you wanted to chime in here. So this is essentially to, it is the future status quo following implementation of both 582 and SB 343 in California. So after those pieces are fully implemented, and we spent a fair amount of time with that Venn diagram chart that we talked about what that future state would be, but also in addition to make task force recommendations to suggest coordination from Oregon DEQ and Cal Recycle around accepted materials list / what is determined to be able to be labeled as recyclable in California. Additionally, to suggest coordination between the Oregon DEQ and that future Oregon PRO around needed investments for materials close to making that statewide accepted materials list. I used my Bluetooth speaker as an example, something along those lines of saying, hey, if you added some sortation devices or there was a stronger end market, maybe in coordination with the area MRFs, which obviously has a strong interaction with the pro under 582, to be able to make it to statewide accepted materials list, that it would, that we would say that this is essentially some additional recommendations as well as that future state where there will be fewer confusing labels on packages because of these statutes that will be fully implemented. And so with this, we had a mixed, so this was, we had 6 that could support as is, 2 that were uncertain, fully 5 that just straight out opposed. So there was no sort of with changes thoughts, but I would let maybe the folks who are uncertain chime in, or I know task force member Bulow had wanted to chime in at this point too. So maybe I'll start with her.
Okay, so back to the point that I had made earlier, which was just that potentially some of these proposals we could include under the status quo plus, or create an additional maybe proposal number 4, which would be that that all of the suggestions regarding how to make the labeling less confusing could pertain to labels that go on packaging, and create two separate recommendations. Maybe would be one that exists that says, how can we make it clear to consumers that the RIC is not the place they need to be going for their information? And this seems a little onerous to me, and I think because it's so embedded in our culture already now that, you know, it has been, we all are used to checking the bottom of the bottle. We are looking for those chasing arrow labels. So maybe this is not the way to go, but I do think it might be worth just putting out there for people to vote on as an option. Like, what if we just said RIC is the RIC, and then all of the efforts are focused on including clear recycling instructions on labeling that is front and center. You know, maybe font sizes are larger that are required on packaging, or, you know, or going back to Anya's point about nutritional information, FDA standards, something like that. But that information then is included on specifically labeling, or, you know, a printed type of information, as opposed to messing with any kind of mold making or anything like that.
So I'm going to still ask you to hold that in mind as we go back through and kind of try to do some wordsmithing and have some pieces to fully understand that. But thank you. That's excellent. Oh, yes, I see that task force member Larmouth has his hand raised.
Thank you, Chair Thomas. So I'm not a lawyer. I know a couple, but I'm not one. But my concern is that if we're hitch our wagon to California and their program and their list, and they get held up in court, which is my understanding of what's going to happen in California, is that there's going to be lawsuit after lawsuit filed. Then we do nothing until California gets things sorted out. That seems like a bad plan. And I don't think anybody's saying that that's exactly what we should do, is do nothing and wait for California. But I think, you know, like we've talked about with the bottle bill and other things, I think if we can move forward, then we may be able to set the example that can pass in California. But I don't like the idea of waiting around for it to all get shaken out in California before we do anything. So I think that's why I voted against this.
Oh, gotcha. I thought you were uncertain. So no, you voted to oppose. Understood. Thank you. And any of the uncertains, and I don't have the voting in front of me, that would like to chime in here. Task force member Larmouth, okay, gotcha. Was a
Just
bad at clicking.
Bad at clicking.
Hey man, join the club. We do have a lawyer on our task force, so task force member Mitchell, would you like to add any additional clarification to that piece?
I'm a recovering lawyer, but yes, I will go ahead and answer, but not from being an attorney that represents anything in this group. I think I agree with what Dave said about waiting to see what happens in California. And I don't think anybody in this room can guarantee that anything that happens in California or Washington are going to stay permanent, or even in Oregon. This isn't constitutional. It's not in California. The first thing we heard after Senate Bill 343 passed down there was the effort to make changes to it. I expect that there will be a number of them, and I don't even know the timeline for implementation in the event there weren't those potential amendments. I know the conversation was the same in Washington when Washington was contemplating truth in labeling language. Last time there was a group that came in from, I think, the producers component that said, be careful following what's happening in California, because California is very likely to change. So I guess I agree with Dave. I would not hitch our wagons in Oregon to something we think may or may not happen in California. And the fact that they moved first is great. But if we can build a better model, let's build a model that's better and have that as an option now for people to consider. So I agree with those comments. And that's probably not from a legal perspective. That's just from knowing what the conversations are being in the legislative process.
Fair
I'll
enough.
take it.
Yeah, and I'm not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV. So a potential amendment here as we move to the Aura proposal, and we're running low on time, so I do want to quick through, is to state that we could amendment to say that perhaps not fully implemented on 343, but to have that recyclability determination be done, because I believe that Dan Brown from Cal Recycle had said that they are going to go through that process, and that would potentially not be hung up in the court. So that may be a method to coordinate with. Again, it's not a random choice, but rather a massive market, which I think would have an impact on what is sold on store shelves here in Oregon. So there is a reason to have those interact, not necessarily just to let the tail wag the dog. So okay. So with that, wanted to get into the Aura proposal. We have the straw person results on the next slide, but Kristen, if I could let you run through this proposal and just recognizing how much time we have left, and trying to be efficient given that everybody has had the time to read the whole thing. Go right ahead.
Sure, thank you. So I just as a point on this is called the Aura proposal because it came from us. I would say that, when I had to fill out the survey this morning, I marked I could support it with changes, right? So it's not a reflection of everything that Aura would like to see in the truth and labeling. It is what I viewed when I looked at the concepts that everybody responded to before the April 4th meeting and how they voted, and put them into this document. So what I said when you saw that document earlier at the top was how I did this, is that all elements in the document are from that ranking that happened before the April 4th meeting. And I listed them in this based on, which I don't think you carried through in here. I listed it based on what the elements were in the survey. And if it's listed, it received a majority vote of support unless I otherwise noted that. And then it showed the number of votes listed. So for element 2, there were 7 votes. So the only time that I did anything different, I also noted those. I didn't include any of the elements that were opposed by the group. And I suggested that all the recommendations that we do in this should be going to the June 1 report to the legislature versus as recommendations to the PRO. So that's a distinction between the other proposals that you had. So unlike what Dylan and Anya did for trying to confirm that everything would meet whatever the chasing arrow standards are in the other 36 states, that's not what I looked at. I looked at what the concepts were that the group replied to for April 4th. So the first one out of the box was the one you see: packaging not on the list cannot have the chasing arrows anywhere on it or make any other claims about packaging being recyclable. And then the sub point under that was the one you just saw in proposal 1: allow recyclability labeling if it has a circle with the line through it. And then the suggestion we went on to 1B was allow glass to be labeled with chasing arrows, but include language recycled separately, because as all of you know that are Oregonians, at least, Oregon doesn't collect glass and commingled. I think people tried it once. It wasn't a very good experiment. That's not what our fiber partners want to see. So there's a distinction where Oregon is different than the rest of the West Coast. And that is important to allow glass to be labeled that way because it is recyclable. It's just not recyclable within a commingled system. So that's the first point. Then 2 goes on. It's the next one up: require clear standardized labeling. That was element 11. It got 10 votes on that. Our suggestion is you limit this requirement to commingled materials on the USCL just for clarity. And that items that would be depot or event collection, if you're using existing infrastructure or producer provided, you label with check locally. That goes back to, we don't want to confuse people with the do not recycle label for things that can be recycled. They just cannot be recycled under the USCL process. So mandating embedded recycling, that was element 13. It got 10 votes for it. Our comment is that is not in lieu of the labeling required in number 2. We recognize this is kind of a beginning project, a sort of a future view for how we can do things even better. But we don't want to exclude existing labeling while we figure out that technology. And then we suggested, think about a pilot project on this. And there's some much better information, I think, that you saw if you were able to watch the report earlier on, now I can't think of her name. Kim Holmes, who did that great work on the recycling characteristics. So this is just our idea, give people a way to figure this out and test it and see how it works. 4 is require that resin code without any triangle or chasing arrows. That was element 4. It had 9 votes in favor. And then we included in that incentivize removal of the RSC with chasing arrows via echo modulation fees. That one was a tie vote, 5-5, with 3 and neutral in that one. But we thought that made sense. It fits together in that piece. Then provide on-ramp for new materials. That is element 20. It got 12 votes. Our point is it's already in the process, and you should also include an off-ramp for those materials that fail. The 6 is the PROs run the state campaign. That's a piece you already saw. That was element 16. It got 9 votes. Our point on that is it still needs to be through the existing process, not something different. 7 was use the pros as a tool for removing non-compliant items. That was element 17. It received 8 votes in favor. Number 8 is require DEQ to review state criteria against enforceable federal standards, blah, blah, blah. Element 10 got 8 votes. Our point is that should be subject to Oregon's legislative oversight, not just a decision made at the DEQ level. I think there's enough interest from the legislature that should be a process that they should have a role in. And Oregon tends to do things differently. Sometimes we can be more stringent than federal law if we choose to. So 9 is create that Oregon USCL after dialogue with California. That got 7 votes on this. Our suggestion is that you revise that so that it under the recognition that Oregon law does not wait to see what another state does. We're a sovereign place. We can make our own choices. So instead you say create Oregon's USCL, informing and discussing with California and Washington partners during the process to consider areas of alignment on the West Coast. I think it's not just California we should be considering, but also Washington if we're going to talk about alignment. 10 and 11 were things that everyone agreed on. Those both got 13 votes in each of those. Provide time for packaging producers. I think that should be an overall comment, like we said previously. And supporting labeling improvements at the federal level, absolutely. I guess the question could be, what do we think are improvements? But it'd be first nice to see some activity, and then we can comment on the specifics. And then finally, echo modulation fees. Number 12 is not one of the elements, other than you did see it in the one previously on requiring the resin code 4A. So it already exists in Senate Bill 582. You use incentives for good labeling, you use disincentives for poor labeling, and then our way to reach that issue that was on element 15, which originally Aura's comment was require the packaging industry through PROs to propose and advocate for federal legislation to remove chasing arrows laws in 36 remaining states. Take that out. And instead you do the work on that through an echo modulation fee, where for every year those chasing arrow laws continue, then the echo modulation fee by the plastic packaging PRO members increases, and you can use those funds for additional contamination reduction and labeling education for Oregon consumers. So these were the elements that when we looked at, we saw from the concepts how it worked together, with the exception of number 12. I think it's pretty clear what we were trying to do, which is just lay it out for everybody to consider every element that was considered, not just those elements that align with how 36 other states have their chasing arrows or what's happening in California. So
thank you, Tess. Thank you, Task Force Member Mitchell. So we did do a straw poll, and so this straw poll was done obviously before this presentation was made, because we received the straw person between them, and we wanted to present them all on equal footing, which we have done here and given time for that. So wanted to offer time for the folks, as we have on the previous slides. We saw that we had 2 members that could support as is, 3 that could support with changes, 2 that were uncertain, 4 that could oppose, and then 2 that could oppose but support with some changes. Wanted to give time to those folks, Task Force Member Brandon, Felton, Bulow, Larmouth, and well, Kristen, you already gave your feedback there. So wanted to give the other 4 folks time to sort of chime in as to what their feedback is, and then perhaps I would suggest take another vote on this proposal, given that now we've had time to digest it, maybe after these questions. But go ahead. Anyone want to chime in? Task Force Member Felton, please.
Thank you, Dylan. And just to be clear, because it's not clear on this side, Ameripan's position was opposed, but could support with changes. I know those are kind of all lumped together on the right-hand side. But is there any way you could go back one slide? Because I'm not going to remember the numbers off the top of my head. So we had concerns with 3, 4, and 12. 3 again goes back to that mandate versus encourage or whatever we want to call it. So I don't need to belabor that. 4, we don't take a official position and have had some discussion about resident identification code, but it goes back to that ASTM standard, right? Which is the triangle with the resin, with the RIC versus just a RIC all by itself. So we just question as to whether or not that makes sense to be going against a standard, even if it's not widely adopted in a whole bunch of states right now. And then 12, it's 12C. So I have some concerns with 12C around sort of using that stick approach to incentivize the producers to get those changes made in the 36 states. We get it, we're working on it, but I also question as to whether or not within statutory language in Oregon, again, I don't know, I'm no expert on Oregon law, but could they even put something like that in statute to drive change in other states? So that's all I have, Dylan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I do want to comment that piece of the component was one that we actually had voted off last time when we did a roll call vote on that 12C component. I did want to say one piece is my reading of the USCL and the process that's going through there is that the RIC actually may be used potentially to help develop that USCL. So we should keep that in mind as we are talking about. I know that that's not the intent. We got some really robust feedback from both Patrick and Steve and our expert Q&A, but I did want to kind of chime in and say that. Task Force Member Brandon, go ahead.
Thank you. I first want to thank Aura and Task Force Member Mitchell for putting in the work and coming up with this. I know it takes a lot of work to do all of that, so thank you all there. I too had some issues with 12C, which I won't belabor since we've dealt with that in a previous roll call vote, but I do also just question how that would work exactly. On the glass and the issue with both with the commingling and then also the labeling things separately for depot, I was wondering, namely for glass, how much of a problem are we solving there? Like to what extent, and this is, I don't know, like how big of an issue is that? And then like, is it worth that added complications with labeling? And the same with like depot or event collection, especially in light of, we don't know what's on the list and where things will be allowed, like making sure that that's flexible enough to match the USCL. And then lastly on 3, I just wanted to flag that I think additional labeling like that is really interesting, but I do worry about just throwing more and more things on a label given how much we already have there without like more instruction. So I love the idea of really clear instruction, but I'm just not sure more letters or more small pieces like that are exactly the right answer. But I do like the idea of, could you integrate some of that information into that QR code or some of the other pieces we've been talking about?
So if I can answer that, I think that that's a really good point. When that consider pilot project is exactly that. It would not be something that would be on the label itself. It would be a scan the QR code. Here's what you get, more information there, not as something that you're going to try and slam on a label that's already covered with too much information, honestly. So that was the theory, and it was just an idea as one of the ways you could look at that in a way that would be clearer and more localized to Oregon. Right, more consistent with how things work in Oregon. You all saw that sheet that Laura Liebrick put together describing the different ways that you can collect recyclable materials, whether they're curbside or at depot or at events or in different, store take back. There's a bunch of different terms. So this was an effort to say, well, why don't we put those terms onto a smart code and try and get people used to that conversation. So that first is the first thing. When you speak about glass, the concern, obviously one of the things we talked about that also got voted off the island was starting with plastic first, figuring out our model and then moving forward over time. So, you don't want to penalize glass as a material that has been traditionally recyclable forever with a, it has its chasing arrows on it somewhere as well. So how do you ensure that also at the same time you recognize it's never going to go in the commingled list, right? Because we don't commingle glass in Oregon, so we want to keep it separate. If there are other ways to do it that don't require a recycle separately or something like that, we'd certainly be open to that. But the point was we did not want to penalize a material that already was a very highly recyclable material, whether you did it at curbside separate in a separate bin or at a depot or in a different system. So just going back to the eco-modulation fees and C, this is a little different. We aren't suggesting anymore that anybody has to go out and do anything from a perspective of going forth and lobbying and correcting what was put in place in 36 other existing states. Instead, we're just saying if those changes don't occur, then the continuing issues we have with contamination and education are going to continue, and we can ramp up the fee for that. One of the models I thought about was back in the day when the federal government wanted to change the drinking age to 21, and the way they did it was say, if you don't do it, we're going to take away your highway funds. There is more than one way to get to a solution that can occur. And funny enough, every state changed their drinking age to 21, and boom, they didn't lose their federal highway funds. So that's just an idea that's out there. It is different than what was voted off the island. We recognize the comments about not wanting to be forced to go correct a problem. And maybe the inability for anybody to require that, but I don't think there's a similar issue with increasing fees for something that continues to go forth. And as far as mandating and recyclability, every one of these, Dan and anybody else that had concerns about that, would be done in over time. It's not like the minute this passed, and remember, this is a report to the legislature. It needs to be turned into a bill and have a bunch of other things occur. It's not something that's going to happen and boom, you're going to have to do this, or you'll be faced with some kind of a penalty. This is a way to get there and to give the producers and the brands and everybody else involved in the labeling pieces time to get that done, which we think is very important. On the RIC code, yeah, we understand you've got an issue with the ATSM and that issue with the triangle piece, but once again, this is timed. Every bit of this would be related to number 10, provide time for packaging producers to prepare for any changes adopted. So, I mean, I think that's an overall overarching concern that we as ORA recognize needs to happen. There needs to be sufficient time, but continuing to do nothing and wait for something to happen has not been a successful approach. So this is why we brought this forward. Hope that answers some of the questions you all raised.
So we have 5 minutes left in our meeting. Thank you for that very robust and detailed discussion of the proposal from ORA and the conversation that we had following the feedback that we received. We do not have time to go through and do the wordsmithing that we had hoped to be able to do during this meeting. My hope is that now that we have all the proposals, we have the input, that we can have some inter-meeting email threads where we have some feedback. And I'm challenged. I don't think we can do votes via email. So I think we would have to do some honing and some presentations, but I would suggest very, very strongly that we would not be making pitches like we have been today of sort of like saying, this is what I support and what I don't support, but rather trying to hone that, because we unfortunately ran over on time. We actually took the public comment time because no one had raised their hand to be part of that public comment. So I think that we're going to have to manage some of this in between meetings, and then really have a front load of voting on things at that next meeting, so we can very quickly get through and hone these presentations. And again, my sincere hope is that the task force members who have their proposals before feel that they've had the time available to be able to really advocate very strongly and forcefully for the components that they believe in deeply. Alex, go right ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I did want to point out, so since the group did move everything to roll call votes earlier, perhaps maybe a refinement of that could be that, it could be voted digitally still, but we would share out the vote count, or we would share out what that roll call vote was. So if we are looking to get things done via email in the interim, that might be something that you all could vote on.
When we do that, is that something that we would have to do in a particular function, or would it just be a response to an email that could say yes or no, or that would be okay?
One of our surveys that.
Oh, would a survey result in that if we were able to share the information out and we had the names, so we had full transparency?
Currently, the rule said that you could vote telephonically or digitally, so therefore, it could cover digitally, but just making sure that that would cover the idea of what roll call was for everyone who voted earlier.
So given that we have 2 minutes left, I want to call a vote for the task force that we are able to vote via email, via some digital format in the interim. And I would just like to see if anybody else would like to vote. And remember, we have to vote physically. So please raise your hand or give me a thumbs up. Any opposed? Great. That has carried through. That's terrific. So we will be able to do some honing via email. We will be, again, endeavor to get materials out as quickly as humanly possible. We've tried to have very fast turnarounds, again, thanks to the incredible help by Alex and DEQ staff to be able to push these materials out. Now that we have everyone had time to be able to get through, I'm going to just share our next steps. Again, we have 3 meetings left. So we have a meeting number 6. We have to finalize a proposal at that meeting. So we need to do honing of this work. So wordsmithing, pushing forward, again, getting closer to where that is. Meeting number 7, we need to work to finalize that report. So there's going to be a lot of writing between meeting number 6 and meeting number 7. And then 8, we're going to be finalizing that report and getting those next steps. So we really have a lot of work ahead of us. We need to be very efficiently moving this forward. So again, my hope is that we've been able to get those comments in for folks. We've been able to have that advocating, and now we can start getting down to actually carving things up, moving through pieces and moving beyond things that we have voted past. Before I break, are there any other questions or comments from the task force members in our last minute that we have? Terrific.
Just echo Dylan's thanks for the thoughtful discussions today, and a thank you in advance for all the homework we will be doing before we see each other again.
Very grateful to our fellow task force members. Thank you all so much for the incredibly hard work that you all did and the thoughtful consideration that of these processes and to help push this forward. Thank you again to my co-chair and again, DEQ, for supporting this effort. Thank you all, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.